Hey everyone, Austin here with my good friend Rich, and we're excited to join you in your house church today as we sit in John and Helen's kitchen and living room. Today's going to be a really special house church teaching as we have our friend Rich who's visited us all the way from England. And Rich is a worship pastor at a community called KXC and has led in a worship movement called David's Tent. And whether you know it or not, whether you're aware of it, the songs that he has written have made their way into our worship gatherings. Mm-hmm. And so we feel like God has intentionally brought Rich to our community in this season as we're talking about the anatomy of worship, how to become a people of passionate praise, to bring some instruction to us on how to be those people who praise God with their whole selves. So, Rich, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, yeah.
Yeah. And if you could describe, what brought you to America? What have you been up to? What does the last week look like?
Yeah, so I've been here for 8 days now. So I first went to Milwaukee, spent some time with a friend, doing some songwriting, and then on to Nashville, doing some more songwriting, and just it's one of those times I was like, hey, it's only 3 hours, let's go. Love to see you all. We've connected at the Asbury Outpouring, at the Awakening Project London, and then just felt, having stayed here before, just felt homesick to be back.
Yeah. In
John and Helen's living room, talking about Jesus, and so really honoured to be here today.
Yeah. Thanks for being with us, and it does feel like home. Definitely getting to be together. And we've had the chance, obviously, to get to know one another a little bit, but I want the rest of our community to get to know you in a similar way. And so if you could describe to us some of your background, how it is you found yourself as a worship leader and as a songwriter, and how God has implanted a heart of worship within you.
Yeah, so I grew up, my dad's an Anglican priest or a vicar. So I grew up going to church, and every summer we'd go to this camp called New Wine. And it's like Bible camp with kids groups. I remember when I was 12 years old, I always loved worship. When I was 12, I had this encounter with God, and I'd describe it as to the closest to hearing the audible voice of God. It was a really weird moment.
Wow.
I was 12 years old, and I just felt the Lord say, lead my people in worship. It's that simple. And then a month later, I was 12 years old, I had my mum's acoustic guitar, and I led worship for the first time. And I continued to do that all through my teens. When your dad's the lead pastor, you can get away with a lot. So it was and it was either me or the organ, basically. So I learned a lot about leading worship through doing that. We'd do once a month this thing called Open to God, and it would be unscripted, unplanned, 2 hours of just spontaneous worship, prayer, ministry of the Spirit. Sometimes Dad would share a message, sometimes we'd just continue in worship, and that was a space that really formed me. And then when I left school, I had a few years of sort of mad traveling, ended up living in Africa, ended up in Holland. It's a long story, for another time, but I'd been invited to move out to Holland to be youth pastor at a church. And then I met this church leader in Uganda, and he said, hey, come out and be the youth pastor. I arrived in Holland. I called him up and said, hey, I'm here. And he'd totally forgotten that he'd invited me to go and be the youth pastor. And I was living as a missionary at that time. So I just stayed and ended up leading worship with him. We'd do these revival nights in very sort of dusty churches throughout Holland. And we'd see the Spirit move. It was awesome. And at some point in that year, I met Lydia, who's my wife. She's Dutch. And then I returned to London to start studying. And then just next door to where I was living was KXC Church.
Wow.
So I joined as a student, and that was 2010. And we've had a few years out of London just because of kids and stuff, but that's been our home since then. 14 years of being in an environment where there's a real passion for worship, but also high value for the word, but at the same time a desperation to see the Holy Spirit move, and a recognition that we just need an encounter with God, and then we need to walk it out in our spiritual formation and discipleship. So it's been an amazing formative place for us as in our own walk. And then I've been leading worship since quite early on, and then really only about 10 years ago is when I started writing worship songs in that context. I remember Tom was the worship pastor at the time, and he'd written this song called The Father's Love. And he'd basically taken one of Pete Hughes's talks and plundered it and put it in a melody. And it just sparked my imagination for, it gave our church language to a conversation to have with God in a way that just lit us on fire. That sparked my imagination. And so I've been doing that for 10 years now, and I love it. It's amazing.
Yeah, we've loved KXC over the years. And that community has been an inspiration for us. And of course, a host community for the Awakening Project this last May in London. And have just come to love the environment of worship and praise that we've experienced there. And, not just in that environment where you've led, but before we ever had the chance to meet, 5 years ago, Maddie and I were in England and walked into a David's Tent gathering in a 1,000-year-old cathedral that was massive, and it was at max capacity, and people jumping up and down, hands in the air, laying face on the floor, and the Spirit of God present in just the most tangible, palpable way. And I'm wondering what that journey has been like for communities like David's Tent or like KXC at a heart level, for those communities to come into an expression of worship like what Maddie and I experienced, and what we both at David's Tent and then again at the Awakening Project.
I think it's been massive. I mean, David's Tent is 12 years ago was the first festival, and the heart behind it was, let's put on an event, but if Jesus would actually come, what would we do? For 72 hours, we'd worship. So that's been every year since David's Tent. They host 72 hours of non-stop worship through day and night. And I think that the few sort of themes that we've experienced. So we went in our first year of marriage, and we led worship at 3:00 in the morning. There was like 4 people in the tent. They were all fast asleep. It was amazing, and it's grown to 5,000-6,000 people.
Wow.
And I think a few of the beautiful things is, so someone once said, if you want to hear the sound of many waters, you got to bring the streams together.
Wow.
And that is David's Tent. So you've got all types of expression: Anglican, evangelical, Pentecostal, Roman Catholic, all these streams coming together, not unifying under a particular distillation of a theological statement, but around the worthiness of Jesus. If Jesus is in the center of the room, we're just going to worship him. And we don't have to always hype people into worship. We just need to make space and have time to really have deep conversations with God, as well as just celebrating. Like we've always got a reason to praise him, even in the depths of the valley. So it's been very formative for us. I know if my wife Lydia was here, she would talk about, I remember it like yesterday, I think it was 2013, there was a moment when Melissa Helser was sharing about how the wells of the Spirit had been covered up by disappointment. And the invitation was that we would dance on top of those wells, and it would release an expression of worship. If you see Lydia worship now, she's not afraid to go wild in God's presence and express everything she has in her. But that moment at David's tent was a life-changing moment for her. She danced like David did. And there was so many moments of her own journey of being hurt in ministry, being hurt through leaders failing her and disappointments, but the choice to say, hey, I'm going to dance on those things. I'm going to offer it up to the Lord. And I think that's been experienced for so many.
So even in those environments that are expressive, and they're welcoming the presence of God, and you're sort of moving away from this classically British impulse to maybe be reserved, to really be like the warriors in the story of Jehoshaphat, the worshipers that lead the nation into battle and victory, right? With a shout of worship. You're like kind of harnessing that spirit. And in that, you hold within yourself the tension of just the realities of pain and hurt and disappointment in life. And at the same time, in that, you're recognizing God's glory.
Yeah, I think that's the place of praise that really counts, isn't it? Again, we were talking earlier about there's a kind of worship and praise that we can only give on this side of eternity, in the context of suffering and pain and disappointment, that we won't be able to do in heaven, because there'll be no more tears, praise God. But that what we offer here is precious to Him. You know, I think of moments in my life where I've been given that choice, where suffering has come, or you know, the most terrible news you can imagine is that you could either turn away from God and say, where are you in this, God? Or actually we live around the cross, and the cross is the place that we recognize that Jesus is acquainted with our sufferings, that he knows what it's like to be betrayed by a best friend. He knows what it's like to be beaten, to be accused of things. He knows what it's like to be disappointed, and to feel the physical pain as well. So that's been a big part of my wife's journey over the last years. She wrestles with chronic pain in her body. And for her, sometimes people ask her that question, like, do you ever say to God, you know, why, where are you? And she, of course, if she doesn't have those moments, she's human.
Yeah.
But her response is, Jesus is the only one who really knows how much pain I'm in. And so I just cling on to Him because He knows it more than anybody else. And so when we approach the Lord with that perspective, then our worship is so much richer. And I think that's where we hold these things in tension of, even in the deepest valley, we have a reason to worship God because of what He's done for us. And at the same time, so there's always reason for joy.
Yeah.
And at the same time, God doesn't ignore our pain. So why should we not bring that into the context of worship, but to offer it up as worship?
Yeah, one of my favorite worship songs kind of incorporates this theme of worshiping God in suffering, or worshiping God in the unknown. And it's the song Hope on the Horizon. And I believe you helped to write that song.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, Rich, if you'd be willing to share with us some of the lyrics that have been most poignant to you as you've led people in worship in that song.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if there was an experience that you held personally, that you had personally, that gave life or gave birth to that music.
Yeah. I mean, that song's really precious to me because I wrote it for people that we're really close with who they couldn't have children. So it was that me and my friend Sam, we were sitting down, we're like, hey, let's write a song for them. And we were looking at the faith of Abraham and Sarah, the whole story in Hebrews of they had faith even though they didn't see it. And so probably the lyric that really gets me every time is, in the space between the now and not yet, there's a song to sing he won't forget. Because a broken heart's not laid to waste if it's an alabaster jar of praise. Wow. Of like, that's to me speaks of what I was saying about the worship in this place of waiting and not having is precious to him. There's a song to sing that he won't forget. For all eternity, he will remember that moment where we are faced with the choice, do I turn away from God when I'm met with suffering, or do I turn towards him as the only one who knows what it really means to suffer in that moment? I remember when we first sang that at David's Tent, 2021, it was the first time we could sing together in the UK for 18 months. And we sang that song. Nobody had heard it before. And then it was actually some really dear friends of mine who are Catholics. That lyric really gave them something to draw into about our communion with the saints, and not just with the people in the room, but that actually we're gathered, we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, and we worship together with them. So
yeah. What would you say, Rich? What encouragement, what exhortation would you give to someone who is maybe coming out of an experience of trauma or hurt or pain, or maybe life just feels too busy and overwhelming to access a place of passion? What encouragement would you give them when it comes to moments of song and praise? Because we have them at every gathering, and I think the authenticity of our singing is really important. And so what encouragement would you give to someone who's attempting to find an authentic place of praise in the midst of a difficult moment?
I think the invitation would always be to do what costs you. And I was thinking of the story of the widow's mite. So for some people, what's costly for them is it is shouting, jumping around, and being the loudest sort of singing voice, even though it's so out of tune, and they're just so unashamed to just express that. Is that you? Oh, amazing, brilliant. But for someone else, what might be their widow's mite costly offering might be just closing their eyes in a moment, or daring to lift a hand for the first time. And so I think there's the danger is that we measure the cost of our offering to him by solely the outward expression, but the actually where you're at today, what you can offer him in your heart and physically as well, is precious to him. So that would be just like to ask that question: what would costly worship look like for me? And maybe that costly worship is like singing that song that you hate. Every single song is like a creed that we're saying together. This is what we believe as a church. And sometimes, honestly, I'm in church and I'm like, actually, I don't know. I don't know if I've got a lion inside my lungs. I don't know how, today maybe I've got something else, an ox, or or I don't know. But sometimes, and that's okay, because all creeds are insufficient. There's no songs that can fully capture even a tiny glimpse of the wonder and the majesty of God, or our response to him. We're just offering these widow's mites every time we sing. Yeah. Even though somebody's probably spent many hours and weeks and years crafting that song to give us a conversation, it still falls far short of what God is worthy of in our expression.
Especially in living rooms.
Yeah.
When sometimes it's Spotify.
Yeah.
So Rich, what I hear you saying is that in the widow's mite story, it's not that God values the perfect gift or that God values the largest gift, but rather the most precious gift that we can give God, the gift that he values the most, is the one that we have to offer. Just whatever sacrifice looks like for us, that's what God values.
I think of a moment I had with my daughter. So River's 10 now, but it was on her 3rd birthday. I had this moment with her where she grabbed my face in her little hands. It's just one of those moments as a parent, you're like, oh. And she looked me in the eyes and she said, "Daddy, I love you. I'm so proud of you because you're not scared of anything." And it was a really, like, it's a moment when I think of it now, it just fills me with love for River. And then I've just been reflecting on that. What she said to me wasn't true about me. I'm so proud of you because you're not scared of anything. I get scared of all sorts of things. And I think for me as a father, it still ministers to my heart. And in the same way, like for those who've been walking with God for longer and have been through different seasons and expressions of worship, that maybe you look back on the things you used to say or the way that you used to worship or the people that you used to hang out with, and you're like, oh, something about that makes me cringe. or just like wince of like, oh, I used to say those things, but I don't know in terms of the revelation I have with you now, God, I don't know if that's true about you. And I think the challenge that God gave to me is like to not disregard or write off the moments in worship that he still treasures. And I think that's been a learning journey for me, to not get so stuck in here of like, I have to have perfect theology, I have to have the perfect way of saying. And I do think we need to strive for the best theology, the best revelation of God, the best response that we can give. That our worship is spiritually inspired, scripturally sound, all of that. We need to strive for that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't just care about the theology, but I do think when we have a mindset, we're not just singing to an abstract noun or to a sky god, we're singing to a Father who loves us. And then the pressure's off. So if you're a worship leader, if you're leading worship and you mess up a song, Jesus doesn't walk out the room. He says he'll never leave us or forsake us. Ephesians says we're seated with him in the heavenly places. So our job isn't to climb into heaven or to convince God to come down, because we're already with him, right? Especially when we gather together, where 2 or 3 are gathered, I'm with you. So Jesus is here. So even if you mess up the song or you sing the wrong song for that moment, God's not going to leave. You might mess up the atmosphere and just laugh about it, because Jesus is probably laughing sometimes when I am notorious for forgetting the lyrics to songs that I've written in church, and I'm leading them and I'm like, I don't know what the words are, but help me out, someone. But it doesn't have to be this perfection, but I think it's all about the heart. The heart posture. What's our heart? Are we responding in worship to what God's done for us, for who he is in that moment? And so I think that for me, that journey to not despise the things in our history with God that he still treasures. And that we hold that tension of, hey, maybe I've outgrown that garment of praise, but he's given me a new one. Right? So...
Well, thanks, Rich. Yeah, it's been such an encouragement to us, as our house church worship is a lot of times messy, spontaneous, unconventional for what we're used to, but God meets us in many powerful moments in his glory. And I hear in what you're saying an invitation to return to honesty and presenting your honest self before God, kind of regardless of how clean or cool that in God's Father's heart. that's not what matters most to him,
Yeah.
but rather the sacrifice and the praise that you're bringing in the moment. That's what he values and he treasures. So,
yeah.
Rich, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So much for joining our house churches this morning.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a joy and a pleasure.
Yeah.
And thanks everyone for sitting in on this conversation. I'm sure it's been an encouragement to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. God bless.
Go Wildcats.